Hi, welcome Simon Hoare MP to 10 by 6.
Hello, thank you for having me.
We've invited Simon on today to talk about two specific things, two recent controversial votes in the House of Commons, one to do with the Environment Bill and specifically to do with the issue of raw sewage being pumped into the seas and rivers, and the other one in relation to the vote around Owen Paterson and his 30-day suspension. And in both cases, Simon voted against the government. So we're going to find out a little bit more about why he did so and some of the sort of extraneous stuff. So fantastic. Thank you so much, Simon, for coming on 10 by 6.
Pleasure.
If we start off with the Environment Bill, can you just talk us through what it is that motivated you specifically to vote against the government in relation to this particular amendment?
Well, I think the health of our rivers and our maritime environment are incredibly important, and certainly as far as our county of Dorset is concerned, the rivers that run through my constituency help make it the beautiful place that it is. And of course, we know how important the tourism economy is to the coastal towns within the county. Now, this is a problem which has been going on since Victorian times. We have an ancient sewage system which does need a huge amount of investing and updating. And I took a view that leaving it to the goodwill of the water companies to sort of get around to it when they wanted to, it may very well have worked, but I wasn't necessarily convinced. And I thought providing more of an impetus and energy to the water companies to do that was the right thing to do. That was in part the Duke of Wellington's amendment, which my colleague Philip Dunn picked up in the House of Commons, which I readily and eagerly supported. And the government reflected upon that and then had a change of heart, which we welcomed, which was why we were all able to vote for the amendment last week, because they had broadly taken up what the Duke had wanted us all to do.
Can I ask you specifically, though, why you initially took a stance? Because so many of your colleagues didn't.
Well, we're all responsible, I suppose, to our own constituents and our own consciences. And there's nothing more unedifying, I think, than one politician lecturing to another about how things should do. At the end of the day, we have to stand or fall by our own decisions. I studied history at university. I happen to think that Edmund Burke was right when he said that MPs owe their constituents their judgment, not just slavishly following views or trends, etc. It was my judgment, having looked at my postbag, having thought about the issue, that a greater impetus was needed, as I say, which is then why I voted for it. And I had said right from the start, way back in 2015, when I was first of all elected, that it was always going to be what was in the interests of North Dorset I was going to place first. And I thought that the main thrust of what the amendment was seeking to achieve was in the interests of my constituents of North Dorset. So I had no hesitation in rebelling against a 3-line whip to vote for it. You don't do it easily. You don't do it with a gladsome heart. It's a weighty decision to take, as I'm sure you'll understand and recognise. But we are there to take difficult decisions. It was a difficult decision and I took it.
Do you think, Simon, that your ability to challenge the 3-line whip actually says something more profoundly about you than it does, again, your colleagues who fell in line a little bit on something that actually turned out to be extremely unpopular?
I don't know. At the end of the day, I'm answerable to the electorate of North Dorset, and as long as I can look them in the eye, and certainly the feedback I've had since that vote, nobody has castigated me. No local Conservative member has castigated me for voting against the government on that. They thought I was right to do it. And I will always continue to do that. I think we do have to serve without fear or favour. I'm really lucky. I chair a select committee, but I'm not bound by the corporate responsibility of being part of the payroll vote. I did that when I was at PPS and gave it up. I am enjoying, I must confess, the freedom of thought, which allows you to think about an issue and arrive at a settled position. Now, it's great when the government and I happen to be in agreement, and I can troop through the government lobby with a happy and gladsome heart. When I think they're wrong, when I think they've arrived at the wrong decision, when I think that they need to have another think and weights of numbers might persuade them to do so, I haven't hesitated in the past and I won't hesitate in the future to stand by my conscience and what I think, as I say, in my judgment, is in the best interest of my constituent. Now, my judgments could be wrong, but I'm prepared to stand by them and justify them. What I couldn't do is just go, well, I voted this way because I was told to do it. I knew it wasn't right, but I still decided to do it anyway. I'm not sure I could look at myself in the shaving mirror and sort of get away with it, as it were.
Yeah, thank you. Tom, have you got any questions specifically?
I've got some questions regarding more on the second issue that we're going to cover, but you know, I'm obviously, you know, I would say that not just your constituency, but I think the whole of Dorset and probably the majority of the country are pleased that you rebelled in this particular instance and did the right thing and voted for cleaner waters and more responsible water companies. So.
Better just pause the interview now, Tom, while I go and polish my halo. But
I've got some questions on the second one that may not be quite as favourable, but pleased about that anyway.
Thank you, Simon, for your answer. If we do move on to probably that, it's turned out to be a lot more controversial, and it looks like it's going to be a much more longer term discussion and debate. Is the vote around the obviously suspension of Owen Paterson and the fact that again the government whipped MPs to, should we say, overturn that suspension, and it's really come back obviously as you know and hit them full on in the face since. Again, you initially stood up and said no. So again, can you take us through your line of thought again? Especially so close together to stand up to the whips.
Well, maybe rebellions are like buses. You know, you wait for ages for one, and then they come along in droves. Can I just correct one thing? The government's amendment, or what became known as the Leadsom Amendment, wasn't there to overturn the Paterson decision.
Right.
It decided to just postpone it, suspend it, right, whilst a review standards procedures were was undertaken. In any event, I thought the conflation of the two issues was fundamentally wrong. This is a very much a housekeeping point, but those sorts of votes are usually called house business. They are matters relating to the House of Commons. They're not particularly party political. Historically, they're not whipped. And I think it's recognised now very widely that it was a mistake to apply a 3-line whip to put colleagues in a position to be dragooned into voting something which they didn't have a particularly, acute appetite to do so. I'd read the report in full. I'd worked very closely with Owen. He'd been a great supporter of the dairy sector when he was DEFRA secretary. He and I did a lot of work at the start of lockdown when COVID was starting to bite, to make sure the DEFRA was providing good support for the dairy sector where and when it needed it. So I thought I had a duty to read the report in full. I did so, and I came to the conclusion that based on the evidence that the Commissioner had seen and the Standards Committee had seen, that he had breached the rules and that a punishment of a 30-day suspension was the appropriate thing to do. That's why I voted for that. I thought the conflation, this was the tiger trap which the government created for itself and then jumped into with gay abandon, was to conflate the two things: the report on an individual and then the process of standards. Now, I personally think that Parliament should review our standards procedures on a 5-yearly basis, i.e. to make sure that it's fit for purpose for that Parliament. I think that's the right thing to do. Totally wrong to conflate it with an individual case. It looked like the government was trying to get a mate, out of the dock and into the fields of liberty. That didn't look good. It looked like we were trying to, or the government was trying to hide a misdemeanor behind some sort of smokescreen of unfairness of the standards procedure. The standards procedure isn't perfect, but it's certainly not as flawed as it was painted as being. So it didn't pass, if I can use that sort of colloquial phrase, it didn't pass the sniff test. It didn't smell right, it didn't look right, it didn't sound right. And I'm afraid, there's nothing worse than somebody saying, well, with the benefit of hindsight. But I don't think one needed hindsight on this. I think everybody knew how it was going to land. This was an issue. I first cut my parliamentary teeth as a candidate back in 1997, along with many other colleagues in the House. And I was unsuccessful, as were most of them, principally because of the sewer of sleaze which the Tory party, or some in the Tory party, had dragged the whole of the reputation of the party through, and it always has been a minority. I think that's a really important point to make. 99.9%, I reckon, of parliamentarians are good, honest public servants trying to do right by their constituents. So it knocked the scab of that particular wound. It had been reopened over the expenses scandal, 2009-2010. That was starting to heal. It has deeply damaged, I think, the reputation both of the doing of politics and the calling, the vocational calling, as I still see it, to be a member of Parliament or a public servant. And irrespective of which party you happen to belong to, this whole episode has, I think, damaged very significantly and quite severely the reputation of politics and politicians. And I am worried, actually, that for those who maybe I could best describe as being semi-detached members of society who are always looking for another reason to do ill, particularly towards the political class, this has added another string to their bow, and I think that's very worrying as well.
It seems that you particularly were aware of this, Simon, again, where many of your colleagues weren't so.
Well, I think, again, without being bored, I think there is nothing worse than somebody who's voted in a way that, I happen to think was right, and I would have voted that way even if it hadn't been a popular way to vote. It transpired to be both, but the correctness of it was my dominant motivation. I didn't. When something has gone wrong. When something has gone wrong when you see people coming out of the government lobby in tears, when you hear of mild-mannered colleagues who have had a real go at a member of parliament in the government lobby, as a number of colleagues did with Owen Paterson, there was fury. Now, there's lots of people who have sort of almost recanted of their vote in some sort of Damascene conversion or whatever. I think they knew it wasn't right, but whether it was out of loyalty to Owen, whether it was out of loyalty to the government, whether it was for a desire for ministerial preferment and a shove up the greasy pole, I don't know. Lots of people would have voted for reasons, and you would have to ask all of them individually as well. All I can answer for is why I voted for how I voted.
Okay, thank you. Tom.
Hi, Simon. Yeah, so could I just ask, obviously this debate and thanks again. I think you're to be applauded in this instance again for your vote. But this whole debate has obviously led on to allegations of sleaze and corruption, particularly within the government ranks. And a closer magnifying glass, if you like, look at MPs and the issue of second jobs. So, do you think you can fully undertake the duties of an MP and fully represent the interests of your constituents if you're spending, say, 5 or 10 or even 15 plus hours a week doing a second job in the private sector?
Yes, I do actually.
Right.
Because this may now sound incredibly sort of old-fashioned and sort of quaint. The role of a member of parliament is far more of a vocation than a job. Mm-hmm. The principal duty that you have is to serving your constituents, both within the constituency and in parliament. But the one thing I've noticed, I'm very fortunate, I chair the Northern Ireland Affairs Select Committee in the House of Commons. We've had, as you probably know, a huge debate in and around the Northern Ireland Protocol and how business works. I think the one thing not very commented upon, but very stark, is the huge gulf of understanding which exists between the parliamentary processes and the doing of politics and how business works. And I think in actual fact, as long as it's all clear, as long as it's all declared, as long as it's all done within the rules, and that's why you need an incredibly robust and transparent system on this, then I have, as a matter of principle, no particular problem with somebody having another job outside of Parliament. I don't, but that's what I've chosen. I've chosen not to. If others have, and they are still able to discharge their duties as a parliamentarian, which I believe that they are, then I think it's actually something to be supported and encouraged, as long as colleagues officials, ministers, and the public at large have the absolute confidence that the rules are clear, robust, and are stringently applied without fear or favour.
I mean, I guess that's the point, is that whether they're able, you know, it's, I guess in other people's minds, there's an arguable point as to whether they can fully discharge the duties as an MP. I'm sure a lot of people would suggest that being an MP is you know, is not just a full-time job, it's a full-time job and then some.
But again, Tom, I think it does depend as well what sort of constituency people represent, because different types of constituencies will generate different types of casework, different types of workload and the like. And that's nothing to do with the size of people's majorities. It's more to do with the type, the character, the tone, the tenor, if you will, of the constituency. So if you're representing, let's say, a large urban constituency, lots of issues there, very different to a more sparsely populated rural constituency. Lots of issues, but different, and different amounts of consumption of time. But there's nobody forcing you to take a second job. I think it always has to be a judgment. The first question one should always ask is, have I got capacity? Do I have bandwidth? Do I have the time to do it? If the answer to that is no, then don't. If the answer to that is yes, you're still under no obligation to do it. You know, if you look at the average take-home pay of a resident of North Dorset today, it's about £19,500. So my 82 grand basic looks like a king's ransom. And we have to remember that. I think we do have to remember that.
Yeah.
Go
ahead, Jay.
Stop in here, because one of the things that I've been obviously doing a lot of reading and researching over the last couple of weeks around this, and I thank you so much for your answer. But I think morally what I would do is I would come back and say, okay, if you have this free time, why not spend it in the voluntary sector learning about society and the constituents and the issues that they're, instead of some sort of lucrative, profitable job that people looking in think, hang on a minute.
Well, you make a fair point, and I would say I think you can do both. I don't think these things are mutually exclusive. But it goes back. The first question is, I'd suggest that any of us who serve in public office should ask ourselves is, have we got the capacity to do something else? And then if the answer to that is yes, and only if the answer to that is yes, then ask ourselves, well, what would we like to do? Do you want to do two types of things, as you've suggested, sort of dedicated volunteering work and some commercial work? Do I want to do one or the other, or do I want to do a bit of both?
Yeah, because I wasn't actually suggesting that they did commercial work. I was suggesting that they used their extra time purely in the voluntary sector to find out how people were living, so it then builds up their knowledge base of their constituents.
But with respect, I mean, I think there is this terrible thing, and politicians, we do allow ourselves to fall into this trap. The great thing that we have, and this is one of my great defences of our first past the post electoral system, is that when you hold your advice surgeries, when you're out in your communities, in your towns, in your villages, bumping into people, talking to people, then making appointments to come and see you, because we have first past the post, whether they voted for you or not, whether they voted at all, if they want political support and help, they have to come to their Member of Parliament. So each and every day, we see, we hear from, we get telephone calls from, we get letters from, we get emails from, we have face-to-face meetings with, either now virtually or physically, and we hear that cross-section of society. That is one of, I think, one of the great joys of being a Member of Parliament, that you can hear from, to use an encapsulating phrase, from the Duke and the Dustman, and everybody in between. And that is a great thing. So to think that we're in some sort of ivory tower, insulated from, isolated from, ignorant about day-to-day concerns of families up and down the land and across our constituencies, it would be a gross mischaracterization.
Right, that's very interesting, Simon, because many Conservatives have come on to the corporate media, BBC, ITV, etc., and they've made exactly that point, that the reason that they or their colleagues are working in the commercial sector is because they fear being seen being out of touch.
I'm not in fairness. I don't think that if one takes a paid second job, that makes you more in touch with your constituents. I don't think that, unless you've got a second job as a, I suppose if you take North Dorset, if I had a second job as a dairy farmer, I might say, well, that brings me more in tune with a large number of my constituents. I think what it does do, it does bring you into better tune with the world of business and commerce and what is going on in UK PLC. And if you look at how a lot of politicians dealt with, I've mentioned the Northern Ireland Protocol, but the whole trade and cooperation agreement when we left the European Union, effectively signed and sealed and delivered on Christmas Eve, coming into force on the 1st of January. Well, if anything wanted to show the enormous disconnect between practical politics and the daily operation of business, I'd suggest to you that is a pretty good example.
Thank you, Tom.
Can I ask something? And this is really, I think, the main crux of the matter in people's consciousness, I would suggest, is not so much the time perhaps that people might be spending in a second job, but whether those second jobs might compromise their decision making, whether they might be acting in the interests of the business for whom they're being paid in the private sector, as opposed to saying things or voting or having quiet words about things that are in the interests of their constituents rather than that business. Now, I think there's an enormous issue here in the House of Parliament, and you I'm sure will be able to correct me about this if I'm wrong with this, Simon. But my understanding in most forms of politics, up to the level of Parliament, so in local politics, in councils and parish, town, county councils, etc., declarations are made about outside interests. And when those topics come up for discussion or for vote, councillors have to declare their interest and not participate, not vote, not say things in debate. Now, it seems to me that when it comes to the Commons, and correct me if I'm wrong, that there is, of course, the Register of Members' Interests, and MPs regularly stand up and at the start of any speech refer the Leader of the House to the Speaker of the House to their entries in the Register of Members' Interest, but then they go on to talk in a way that could, in my mind and in the mind of many people, may represent a conflict of interest, and they go ahead and vote. I mean, let me just give one example, which is it's now very well publicised that Nadeem Zahawi, for over 2 years, was the Chief Strategy Officer for Gulf Keystone Petroleum, for which he was remunerated over the best part of £1 million over 2 years. Now, all he had to do, it seems, when discussing issues around climate change and fossil fuels and the oil industry and energy, etc., is to stand up in the House of Commons and say, I refer the Speaker to the Register of Members' Interest, and then he could say whatever he wanted and vote however he wants. Now, that to me just seems utterly bizarre and creates clear conflicts of interest. So I just wanted to share all that with you, Simon, and ask for all your thoughts.
Well,
on that.
I think, Tom, you make a valid point. And I spent 12 years as a district councillor and 4 years as a county councillor. And you're right, particularly when it comes to planning matters, for example, if you know the applicant or you are the applicant or the applicant is a neighbour of yours or something, then you effectively recuse yourself from the discussion and the vote. I think you've made a very interesting suggestion there. That because first of all, your assessment is right. All somebody has to say is, I refer you, Mr. Speaker, to the Register of Interest, my entry in the Register of Members' Interest, and the box is ticked. The job is done, and we do have, this is where the wonderful quirky quaintness of politics often runs in into the modern world, like sort of running into a bit of a cold shower. We refer to ourselves, as you know, as honourable and right honourable members. And the key word there is honourable. There is a presumption that all that we do, that all that we say, and all how and why we do it is effectively supported by a foundation stone of honourability. And as I said earlier in the interview, I'm fully convinced 99% of my colleagues in all parties are as honourable as the day is long. But we are all familiar with the phrase of it's one rotten apple that spoils the whole barrel. I think you make, Tom, a really interesting suggestion as to whether or not, if one has an interest and you are voting in something which may have a benefit or indeed a harm, directly or indirectly, to that company with whom you have an interest, it may be sensible then to not be able to, you might be able to speak on it, because at the end of the day, you will be bringing your knowledge and experience of that sector and seeking to sway the argument by your advocacy. I think that's probably okay. But I think, as I say, you make an interesting suggestion as to whether or not people should then be allowed to vote on that subject. There is going to be a review of the of standards as a result of these last few weeks. Chris Bryant, who's the Labour chair of the committee, and I are great mates. It's a thought that I will take to him, and I will credit you with the authorship of it.
Thank you, Simon. And you know, just as another example, which I'm sure you're very, very aware of, because again, it became somewhat of a scandal against your party at the time, was again, a classic example of this is that there was the bill. I know that MPs talked a lot about the intricacies of the bill and what it meant for private landlords. But there was the bill a few years ago that required private landlords to make their homes fit for human habitation. And of course, the government voted down that bill or that amendment. And 72 of those Conservative MPs who voted against that were private landlords who registered earning more than £10,000 a year from their ownership of property and renting out property. Now, that seems scandalous that such people are allowed to vote on that specific issue. That's just another example.
I must confess, I think that was a totally artificial construct created by the left, which bears absolutely no comparison with reality. The private rented sector is fiercely competitive. Let me declare my interest. I rent out our house in Oxfordshire. So I suppose I am a private landlord. We all conform to, you have to conform to, for your insurance purposes and everything else, all of the right emission standards when it comes to your boiler, your electrical safety. Nobody is going to rent, I'd suggest, any property that is not in a habitable state. No agent would take it on to put it on their books unless it met the very highest of prevailing standards. So whether you are a member of parliament, whether you're a member of the public renting out a property, we are all obliged to meet the prevailing standards. And thank God, our standards in the rented sector are incredibly high, which is why it's a very safe sector in which to rent. We got rid of the Rackmans of this world a long, long time ago.
Can I just jump in? Sorry, Tom.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I should jump.
Go ahead.
I think we need to avoid left or right, because I don't think anybody really knows where the left begins and the right ends, and vice versa. So I think that's can I just finish? If I just finish, sorry. So if we just stick to
it's thick, which well, certainly the party led by the Labour Party at that time, led by Jeremy Corbyn, sought to beat the Tories with the fact that there are Labour MPs who rent out properties seem to have passed them by. It was another and luckily Keir Starmer doesn't do this sort of politics now, thank God, because it's hugely unedifying. But it was a Corbynista trick to try and drive a wedge to do the them and us sort of bit, that all Tories were fantastically wealthy and, you know, living off the back of the poor and all the rest of it. And it was a ruse which the electorate didn't fall for. They saw through it as much as I did.
I think my issue here, Simon, is that your experience, for example, of being a private renter may qualify you to be an expert in terms of maybe the renting out of your house in Oxfordshire. But I know, for example, many properties that are substandard that estate agents are quite happy just to get rid of and move on to the next couple on the list or the next family on the list. And the standard that, can I just say, sorry, the standard of those properties is
owned by members of parliament.
No, but this wasn't about members of parliament per se, was it? This was about a piece of legislation that sought to ensure that the standard and quality of the private rented sector was as high as possibly could be. And in this instance, what Tom is saying is that Tory MPs or Conservative MPs and Labour MPs who were also private landlords were able to vote on this in their own interest, or at least that's how it was perceived from the outside.
Yeah, and as I say, Tom may very well have a valid point that when one has an interest which directly bears on something that one either owns, or if a colleague is advising a company on a certain piece of strategy or whatever, there may very well be a very strong argument that one would recuse oneself from that particular vote on that particular. As I said,
thank you.
And could I say on that, Simon, I mean, thanks for taking that point on board. I think it goes to the very heart of our democracy, in our parliamentary democracy. And I don't understand why it seems to be different in Parliament compared to how it is, you know, as you discussed, at a level such as, you know, a council level. It just seems very bizarre.
As I say, a point not lost on me.
No, and you know, if you're able to take that forward and effect, you know, and argue for change in that respect, I think you'd be doing our democracy a service, and a lot of people would support you in that. I hope your colleagues would.
Well, as I say, I will take you to the chairman of the Standards Committee, and there will be a call for both evidence and, I suppose, thoughts and suggestions in due course. And I shall certainly lay that before him. It will then be up to the Standards Committee, the Commissioner, and the House authorities to decide whether or not they wanted to proceed on that.
Thank you very much. And would you mind, at some point that you feel it's relevant, when there's some sort of progress either way, could you get in touch with us to let us know how that's progressed? Maybe even come back and discuss it.
Very happy to indeed.
I think finishing off on such a positive note is probably the best place. Can I just say thank you so much, Simon, for coming on. We really respect you and really thankful for it. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I'm obliged. Thank you. Bye-bye.